This part of the Council Bluffs Angel reads like an ancient Greek tragedy. The tragic characters are Mrs. Julia Wilkins, who was beaten with a hammer and a pipe. She was mortally wounded at her home but not dead. She died later in the evening of Thursday, February 27, at an Army hospital. Dr. Walter K. Wilkins, Julia's husband, who committed suicide rather than be executed by the state of New York for the crime of killing his wife, that he did not commit. Miss Audrey Munson, the model and actress whose career was severely damaged after being falsely tied to the crime, and spent the last 64 years of her life in an insane asylum. She wasn't insane. Miss Ann Dodge and Mrs. Ella Dodge Pusey, who wanted to honor their mother in a measure that was equal to the funeral that honored their father, but were too ashamed to publicly dedicate the monument. Council Bluffs, Iowa, an old historical railroad town, and with an exception of a very few people, did not realize what an extraordinary treasure the Council Bluffs Angel was and is today. In the state of Iowa, the Ruth Ann Memorial Fountain is the only memorial with an allegorical statue on the National Register. The statuary in the state capitol building and grounds come under another category. The evil of this tragedy is not an old vengeful Greek god but superbia, that is inordinate pride. Secondly, avariscia, also called greed. These are usually 3 and 4 on most of the 7 deadly sins list. In this case, it begins with the injustice system of Nassau County, New York, the consultants that the prosecutor used, the news media and film industry that turned on Miss Munson. In the newspapers and film advertisements, she went from a Cinderella to a beguiling evil nymph. A candidate sin for the 8th deadly sins, inordinate egotism, which also could be called politician syndrome, is manifested in this tragedy as the compulsion to achieve notoriety that justifies misinformation, exaggerations, and fabrications. To better understand Part 3 of The Secret of the Angel and how a brutal murder in Long Beach, New York affected the Council Bluffs Angel, we need to look at the village of Long Beach and the Dr. and Mrs. Wilkins. The tie-in to the Council Bluffs Angel through Miss Munson, the model, will come later. In 1919, Long Beach was classified as a village by the state of New York. Today it is a city. It is located in Nassau County on Long Island. Immediately to the west of Nassau is Queens County, then Brooklyn County, and to the east and the rest of Long Island is Suffolk County. Let's take a closer look. Long Beach is also the name of the barrier island where the city of Long Beach is located. The island is of modest length and 10 miles long, nothing like Padre Island off the Texas coast that is 113 miles long. For reference, here are the tri-beaches of Coney, Brighton, and Manhattan, all 3 in the borough of Brooklyn, which is also a county. And here is Manhattan Island. Even during its village days, Long Beach called itself the city by the sea. Here is an aerial photograph of Long Beach about 1912, just as the residential houses boom was starting. If the photograph was enlarged, we would see the boulevards are packed with cars and the boardwalk is loaded with people. Long Beach, the city by the sea, was still primarily a resort town back then. Written history of Long Beach goes back to the late 1600s, but it really gets going in 1880 when the Long Island Railroad built a spur across the Back Bay to the island and the huge Long Beach Hotel was built. In the days before air conditioning, the cool breeze off the ocean, sometime 10 degrees cooler than New York City, made sleeping a pleasure at night, and during the day there was the sun and sea. After the Long Beach Hotel, more and more hotels were built on the ocean side of the island. The Nassau Hotel, shown here, was one of these hotels and plays an important part in the events of 1919. In 1917 it was converted into a hospital to treat wounded soldiers returning from the Great War in Europe. In 1907, William H. Reynolds threw his energy into developing Long Beach. He was a self-made millionaire in his teens and the youngest state senator ever of New York State at 24 years old. He was a developer and a manipulator. His Dreamland extravaganza opened in 1904 on Coney Island. Twice he was indicted by a grand jury, once found guilty but was always able to avoid jail. To develop the island, Reynolds and his investors dredged the Back Bay to make Long Beach more of a true island. It was the largest dredging project since the Panama Canal. He also shored the banks to create a defined coast. With these improvements and improved railroad service, the island was ready for residents with daily schedules to and from New York City, not just vacationers and weekenders. With the completion of the tunnels under the East River between Manhattan and the Queens in 1910, Long Beach could be a bedroom community for the professionals working in Manhattan. Long Beach to Pennsylvania Station was less than an hour ride on Long Island Railroad. In this colorized photograph, taken about 1911, we see the beginnings of the estates of Long Beach. The blue arrow is the Long Island Railroad Station. The green arrow was the City Hall clock tower. The red arrow is the approximate position of 169 East Olive, where the Wilkins lived from 1914 to 1919. Julia Catherine Wilkins, née Pitschke, came from an educated and wealthy first-generation German-American family. She and her brother were born here. She lived most of her early life in or near the West Village area. Her brother, William, was a judge on the powerful Manhattan court. Her first husband may have been Charles J. Nerbas, a lawyer in her father's law firm. If she and Charles did marry, they divorced young. On April 14, 1881, she married Otto Kraus. On April 28, 1882, her only son, Leon Kraus, was born. Otto Kraus, her husband, was born in Brazil in 1853 or 54. Julia lent Otto $40,000 to start an import wine and spirits business. He was very successful and had his office at 1 Broadway, New York City. This is the same building that General Dodge had his office until 1907. Otto was unfaithful and had a mistress in Harlem. After discovering a telegram by Otto to his mistress, Julia had detectives follow and get pictures. In the telegram, Otto postponed a tryst with his mistress due to the funeral of his son Leon Kraus. The divorce battle went to the Superior Court of New York. Julia and Otto were divorced on August 19, 1903. The divorce decreed by the Superior Court had an unusual clause. It states that Julia may remarry, but Otto cannot remarry until Julia dies. By the way, here is a picture of a collector's bottle of invalid port imported by Otto Kraus of 1 Broadway, New York. It is called invalid port and the word wine does not appear on the label. At 20% alcohol, that is 40 proof, it was supposedly a therapeutic tonic, not a wine, and somehow it was legal medicine for an undefined ailment. The history of invalid port goes back to the early 17th century. Using World War I as a crisis backdrop, a war where we were not attacked first, President Woodrow Wilson limited the alcohol content of beer to 2.75% to supposedly to conserve wheat for export. Most beer then was made from corn and barley. The usage of barley and wheat is not interchangeable. The U.S. farmers were transitioning from mules to gasoline tractors and there was a glut of grain. The men simply drank twice as much beer to get the same buzz, and the women drank a lot of therapy. In some states, the governors got into the act of controlling the people and mandated 1.6% beer. The feds also prohibited selling any liquor to men in uniform. Effectively, the government was declaring war on American brewers who were mostly of German heritage. The common people flagrantly defied the ruling elite by drinking more beer and therapy, resulting in the Volstead Act that is commonly known as Prohibition. In most locales, the ruling elite still had their country clubs with sophisticated secret ingredient cocktail that made a smokescreen display of complying with Prohibition. According to the death certificate of Dr. Walter Keene Wilkins, he was born in Gotham, Maine, March 26, 1852. Other documents indicate March 23 and either York, Maine or Concord, New Hampshire. In an old census, his father's occupation was recorded as a landlord and a farmer. Walter left the farm at 15 to clerk in a store in Boston. Eventually he moved to Detroit and then to Kalamazoo, Michigan, where he worked as a property clerk at an insane asylum. In his spare time he studied medical text and journals available at the asylum. About 1875 he moved to San Francisco, California. There he met his first wife, Grace Mansfield. She was the daughter of a successful Napa Valley farmer and banker. Her parents helped Walter with an allowance of $150 a month to finish medical school, back east, at Bellevue Hospital and College in New York City. After finishing residency, the couple moved to the West Coast. The doctor first tried to establish a practice in Seattle and then in San Diego. Ultimately, he returned to New York where he could connect with former associates. Grace stayed in California and divorced Walter on the grounds of desertion. The doctor's second wife was Susan Ann Hardy. Dr. Walter Wilkins was her fourth husband. Her first husband was Confederate States of America's Brigadier General William Wedby Kirkland. He was also a Union officer and he fought in the Second Opium War in China. That was the war where we helped France and England legalize and commercialize opium into the Qin dynasty. China also lost 600,000 square miles to Russia. William and Susan Ann's youngest daughter was Elizabeth Lee Kirkland. She and her mother have a role in this history. Elizabeth's stage name was Miss Odette Tyler. She is also considered the mother of the Los Angeles Philharmonic Orchestra. Her godfather was General Robert E. Lee, hence her middle name of Lee. Elizabeth's uncle was Confederate General William J. Hardee. Ironically, General Dodge faced Hardee, July 22, 1864, at the Battle of Atlanta. The battle is the most critical battle in U.S. history between the Revolutionary War and the Battle of Midway in World War II. Without Dodge being where he was and doing what he did, the battle could have been lost for the Union, and President Lincoln not re-elected. We would have been two bickering countries and world history would have been completely different. For at least 10 years, Miss Odette Tyler was the most acclaimed English-speaking stage actress and honored by Queen Victoria. She only did one movie. The stage was her throne. Before getting into the details of the fateful night in Long Beach, there is something more to know about the doctor. It is not obvious and probably not characteristic of men of that time. He was handsome, at least when younger, and extremely social. His friends were the elite of the Broadway performers and he was well acquainted with the hangouts. One of the last communications before committing suicide was to an owner of a hotspot back about 1900. His gallant social persona may be what attracted his wives. He presented himself as a Renaissance man deferring decision-making to his ladies, but in closer examination it appears he needed a strong woman to make decisions. After Julia's death he does irrational things and searches for a strong celebrated woman that would know what to do. We already met her, Miss Odette Tyler, daughter of strong wife number 2. Vainly, maintaining the image, it really gets him convicted of murder. The doctor and Julia were married July 21, 1906. At first they lived in a double apartment that Julia owned at 164 and 166 West 65th Street. It was a great location. It was a block and a half away from Central Park and less than a half a block from Upper Broadway where the streetcars ran. The doctor still kept his office at 165 West 54th Street, although he was pretty much retired by 1919. Then in 1914 the Wilkins bought a home in the estates of Long Beach. Their home was less than a half mile to the train station and equally close to the famed boardwalk. Best of all, it was big enough and had a nice yard for Julia to have pets. The address was 169 East Olive Street. The home was, and still is, a larger two-story bungalow. Julia was severely beaten with a hammer and a pipe as the couple arrived home about 9:30 p.m. on February 27, 1919. She didn't die until 11:45 p.m. at the Army Hospital, the converted Nassau Hotel, that had cared for the soldiers. At first the case was covered by local newspapers. When Audrey Munson's name, for the flimsiest reason, was tied into the case, it became a national obsession. The movie houses re-released her movies and one movie was respun into a different story by changing the on-screen printed dialogue. Audrey impersonators were going on stage at the movie houses after the movies played and stripping down to nothing and striking poses that mimicked Audrey in the movie. The national obsession was caused by politically ambitious Charles Robert Weeks, the district attorney of Nassau County. Audrey Munson and her mother Kitty had rented a 2-room apartment from Julia Wilkins on West 65th Street. In the same building that the Wilkins had their city residence that we saw before. Audrey and Kitty moved out in November of 1918 so Audrey could look for work in Canada. Dr. Wilkins managed the apartment and supposedly, according to Weeks, said that Audrey should not get married and lose her figure. If this was said, the sexual connotation was meaningless. Audrey's body in some form of nudity was known by most of the males in the country. In statue, photography, painting, or movies, Audrey's body was on display and no male wanted her body to change. With this excuse of what the doctor supposedly said, Weeks held a press conference on March 24, 1919 with local press and the Associated Press. According to Weeks, Audrey was a person of interest and needed to be questioned. The most famous celebrity in United States, of 1914, 1915, and 1916, was in Canada, and was nowhere to be found. That is if one did not look too hard. Weeks caused a woman hunt for Audrey that appeared in even the smallest weekly newspaper in remote western towns. We would not see that kind of attention for a woman hunt until the 1930s for Ma Barker, the gangster leader, and Bonnie Parker of Bonnie and Clyde fame. Doesn't Bonnie know the smoking will kill her? For a moment think of Ann Dodge and Ella Pusey, who now was seeing the flood of newspaper pictures of Audrey Munson, the woman who was in some way tied to this brutal murder and who brazenly disrobes for a living. Ann was 54 years old. Ella is 61, and to them, only the most immoral women would do what the Munson woman does. The angel was supposed to memorialize their beloved mother. Ann may have telephoned or met with Daniel French, we don't know, but after the March 3 letter of 1919 by Daniel French to Ann Dodge, the communications go silent until 1924, when Ann finally wrote French a thank you note. The author of this video has reviewed more than 80 feet of 35mm microfilm that is archived in the Library of Congress just on Daniel French's correspondence regarding the Ruth Ann Dodge Memorial Fountain. On the left is a picture of the Wilkins home taken the day after the murder. On the right is the home today with minor changes from 1919. Notice the brick chimney in the photographs. 4 floors directly below in the basement would have been a large coal-burning cast iron furnace. A basement coal chute to deliver coal for the furnace would have been in the front left. Twice a day during the winter, coal had to be shoveled into the furnace to keep the house from freezing. If the owner was absent, a neighbor or furnace man came. To stoke the furnace man or a neighbor had a key to one doorway into the house. Usually it was on the side or back. If the owner had pets, and the owner was gone for a few days, a trusted furnace man or neighbor may have also been employed to feed them and take them outside. The location of Julia's terribly beaten body is shown here. At first Dr. Wilkins didn't know the extent of the injuries in the darkness. It was approximately 9:33 p.m., and in the back of the house away from the street lights. She was crying and he got her a pillow from the house. When the doctor realized how serious it was, he went to a neighbor. The Wilkins did not have a telephone. The doctor probably knew the elderly Mr. and Mrs. Errol in the adjacent house to the east did not have a phone either. The Colemans across the street would have a phone because of Mr. Coleman's job, but they were not home. The author of this video believes that on the night that Julia was killed, the doctor followed Julia into the house. Julia charged into her house first to protect her pets, the 2 collie dogs, the parrot and monkey. The doctor's story to the police has him telling Julia to stay outside while he entered the house to bravely confront the intruders. According to the doctor, Julia stayed outside, but her hat and purse were found in the entryway. The street cops of the day, who had no qualms in using saps and brass knuckles, probably could not imagine any man being such a wimp, letting the little lady go in first. The old doc wanted to be the hero for his beloved wife and wasn't. The police barely looked for the 3 robbers that the doctor said were in the house. To the police, the doc had lied, had the opportunity, and on the surface had motive, so therefore he had done it. The timeline and evidence didn't work, so they adjusted it where needed. To the police, the doctor staged and executed it somehow, someway, so they would do what was necessary to get him convicted. Pushing for a quick arrest was William H. Reynolds, the developer of Long Beach Estates. He had been behind almost every improvement on the island for 12 years, and he dredged the channel between the island and Long Island. In the summer of 1918 he had declared bankruptcy. Loan payments for all the streets, utilities, and dredging the channel had come due. Where once the upper class strolled along the 2.2-mile-long boardwalk he built, spending money at the hotels, restaurants, and his casino, there were now penniless soldiers in wheelchairs and on crutches. The war and the Spanish flu had nearly shut down his deluxe hotel, the Lido Beach Club. The lots of the estates of Long Beach were not selling. To make matters worse, there were robberies in homes of owners who lived in the city during most of the winter but summered in Long Beach. The old chief of police had been fired, the new chief wasn't doing much better. Approximately 300 people permanently lived in the village of Long Beach if you don't count the Walks. The Walks, WALKS, is a neighborhood that Reynolds populated with $2,500 prefab bungalows. He leased the bungalows primarily to the Army as temporary housing. In the village of Long Beach, the Army had the hospital and a motor pool garage. The garage was less than 2 blocks from the home of the Wilkins. On Long Beach Island was a cavalry unit to patrol the beaches, and at one end was a small battery. The battery was nothing like the 4 big 12-inch mortars and 2 6-inch rifles at Fort Tilden on nearby Rockaway Beach. The Wilkins murder and robbery could be a devastating blow to the Long Beach Estates neighborhood, if it was a gang from Brooklyn or the Queens robbing and beating old ladies to death. But if it was a crazy old doctor that killed his old lady for her money, what could the police do to prevent such a thing? And clearly such an isolated incident between a married couple wasn't a threat to anyone else or any prospective property buyers. In less than a day, the chief of police called Reynolds requesting to hire the Schindler Detective Agency to find the killer. Even though Reynolds had no official status in Long Beach government at the time, he still ran the island. A quote from Reynolds was, "No burglars, sneak thieves or marauders would have the hardihood to invade Long Beach." The implication of Reynolds' statement is that since the killer wasn't an invader, then he must already be here. There are 4 versions of what happened on the night of February 27th. The doctor has one version of him bravely battling the robbers that he later exasperates even further, by altering Julia's will and fleeing the city under a false name. District Attorney Weeks had 3 versions, one developed by the police and sheriff where the doctor beats Julia in the upstairs bedroom and drags her body outdoors to the rear of the house. Supposedly dragging the body outside to the rear of the house is what the doctor would have theorized that 3 burglars would have done. The second scenario is one in greater detail by a private investigator, but in this version the beating occurs in the entryway hall and then Julia is dragged outside. These 2 versions were presented in one form or another to the grand jury to get an indictment. In the final version presented at the trial, supposedly the doctor beats Julia in the backyard. In these versions the doctor uses both a hammer and a lead pipe he secretly had hidden in the house. To the prosecution, the doctor must have theorized 3 robbers using 2 weapons would make the most believable story. After Weeks' announcement on March 20 that Audrey Munson, the world's first supermodel, needed to be questioned, the Wilkins murder case was of such national prominence that someone had to be convicted and sent to the electric chair. Only these 4 versions, in the 4 months from the time of the murder until the conviction, were cited. Even though all 4 have huge holes and inconsistencies, the notoriety was so great the legal system could not step back and say, "We don't know." 2 weeks after the doctor's conviction and his suicide, a teenager that murdered his boss with multiple hammer blows confessed to murdering Julia, then he unconfessed. Also, when Julia's will was probated in the fall and during subsequent testimony, it reveals judicial abuse by District Attorney Weeks and his hired private investigator. Last, in September 1937 the case was featured under various names by True Detective magazine. The primary private investigator reveals further misconduct. With the new information, and not being forced to accept either what the doctor said or what the prosecutor said, as the jury had to back in June of 1919, we can explore the truth. So over 100 years later, let's investigate what really happened. For some reason the Wilkins were on the 9:15 train. Usually they would have been on the 7:55 train or even earlier. Also, they did not arrive at the Long Island City Station together. Julia was by herself when boarding the 9:15 at the Long Island City Station, and the doctor was already on the train coming from the big Pennsylvania station in Midtown Manhattan. Maybe he was detained with the end-of-the-month rent transactions and he was carrying $440 in cash. The 9:15 train pulled into the Long Beach station at 9:06, 9 minutes early. It would have taken the Wilkins about 2 minutes to collect their belongings, detrain, walk up the train platform, and into the station. For the next 29 minutes until 9:37 there are 4 different versions. The state's 3 versions all have the Wilkins leaving the station to walk home at 9:08. The doctor says they left about 9:19. Conductor Boyd, the only person without a stake in this chronicle, and who operates on exact railroad time, says the Wilkins were still in the station but departing at 9:15. The author will present a version starting with Conductor Boyd's time. Here is the train station back then. The train arrived at 9:06 and the Wilkins entered the station at 9:08. After entering the station, Julia used the restroom for about 6 minutes. Then after she buttoned up for the 12-minute walk home, she rejoined the doctor in the lobby. They gathered their things and headed for the exit. Conductor Boyd saw them leaving. Outside the temperature was only 34 degrees, the wind was howling and the waves were noisily pounding the shoreline. Snow in the city was predicted for the next day. The Wilkins said goodnight to Sergeant Harry Schneider as he started his downtown rounds. Later, Schneider would claim they left together at 9:08 and he walked most of the way with them, thereby contradicting Conductor Boyd's testimony. The state's versions needed those 7 minutes between 9:08 and 9:15 for the doctor to beat his wife with two different weapons he had hidden, beat the male collie, drag Julia outside in two versions, but not the one where he beats her outside, mutilated his clothes, crush his bowler hat, and stages the house to look like three burglars had ransacked it from the attic down. Then make it look like the burglars sat for some time at the table drinking and smoking. Keep in mind the old doc was a month short of his 67th birthday and had a fairly severe heart condition. He probably could not have done what he was supposed to have done in well over an hour, but someone benign to the real estate sales and catchable by the police had to take the blame. With apologies to the viewer, there would have been shops and other buildings shown here in 1919 from an aerial view if one existed. From the train station to their home and up the driveway, the distance is exactly 4/10 of a mile. At 2 miles per hour for an elderly couple of 67 and 63 in full Victorian dress and heavy woolen coats, it takes 12 minutes to cover the distance. Walter had a folded umbrella, an alligator satchel with food for them and their collies. Julia was fighting the wind to keep her hat on, and she was undoubtedly wearing proper Victorian lace-up boots with a modest heel. Their entire yard at their home was fenced so their collies could play outside. The Wilkins opened their gate and proceeded up their driveway to the side door. The time they arrived at the steps to the side door was 9:27. Now let's get a better feel to what happened based on the evidence and using logic. Here is the house today, but back in 1919 there would not have been this rear addition. The Wilkins got to their gate at 9:26. They opened it and walked up the driveway. At 9:27 Julia knew something was wrong. The collies should have been yipping for their treats after hearing the gate close, but there was silence except for the wind and the door looked slightly open. Julia immediately charged up the steps and into the house and barely saw the intruders. She was focused on Duke, the alpha male collie, who was lying still on the floor and bleeding from his mouth. Duchess, the meek female collie, was nowhere to be seen. Julia dropped her purse and went down on her knees to comfort Duke. Her hat fell off and Duke whined weakly. In the meantime, the doctor was a few seconds behind her negotiating the steps in the dark with his satchel and umbrella cane. He was calling out to Julia. Julia was muscular and fit and would have taken on a platoon of the Kaiser's finest for her pets. The intruders paid little attention to the old woman who was on her knees talking to the dog. But there was a male coming through the door that could be a threat and maybe worth robbing. There were 3 intruders. The tall one grabbed the old man and pinned him to the wall, demanding money. The doctor, carrying $440, tried to fight back. In the confrontation, the tall intruder got out a club. Probably in raising the club, to knock the old man in the head, the club hit the doctor's pocket watch, cracking the crystal and jamming the hands at 9:28 and a half. The rap on the head was hard, but the doctor's stiff bowler hat distributed some of the blow. The old man went down dazed. In the meantime, with the door open, Duchess, the meek collie, who'd been in hiding and scared of all the noise, ran outside to the safety of the dark backyard. Julia instinctively got up and followed her. Julia probably knew where Duchess would go. Julia was frantically and loudly calling for Duchess. The tall intruder told the other 2 robbers to go take care of the woman and went back to the dazed old man to search for valuables. The tall man found a wallet, but not the $400 that was probably in a money belt. He also found a tie pin that was called a love knot pin in the pocket watch. He may have opened Julia's purse and tossed it down. Outside, one of the robbers hit Julia in the head with a lead pipe and she yelled for help. He hit her twice more and she finally went down, but she was tough and still yelling something and crying. The second robber dropped down on her back and hit the back of her skull 10 times with a hammer until she stopped yelling. It was now 9:31. The tall man was done with the old man and left the house. He had the pocket watch, that he did not know was broken, a wallet, hopefully full of money, and a tie pin, also hopefully, with a real diamond. He went outside to where the woman was, still holding what he had taken from the old man. Most likely it was the tall man that pulled off Julia's necklace and in doing so realized how terrible his 2 accomplices had beaten her. The tall man stood up, motioned toward the back gate, and from his hand that was carrying the watch, the cracked crystal from the watch dropped on the pathway as he started walking. He opened the wallet, and all that was in there was a measly $40. He put the bills in his pocket with a diamond tie pin and threw the wallet at the fence. Next, he could feel the pocket watch did not have a crystal and held it to his ear. It wasn't running and wasn't worth keeping. The pocket watch chain was tangled with the necklace, and as he approached the gate and in disgust of how badly the robbery went, he threw both away. The only good the tall man had gained in the terrible night was a tie pin and $40. The bad was the beating his partners had given the old lady. The cops, even as incompetent as they were in Long Beach, would be hunting them down for sure. His partners were either too stupid to know what they had done or maybe they liked killing. They exited the back gate and it was almost 9:33. Walter had been dazed by the blow to his head, then he heard Julia moaning. He got to her about 9:34. After trying to comfort her and determine her injuries, he went back into the house and got a pillow. He turned on the exterior light and put the pillow under the side of her head. Realizing how badly she was hurt, he went to get help at 9:37. Before seeing how Walter gets help and the arrival of the police, ambulance, the sheriff department and the neighbors, let's quickly see what was wrong with the other four versions. If we go by the doctor's hero version where he encountered the robbers first and tells Julia to get help, Julia should have gone down the driveway to neighbors she knew were home. They had walked by neighbors with their lights on. She would not have been in the backyard. And she still would have had her hat on and carrying her purse. The first two version by the state, have the doctor beating her in the house then dragging her body outside, beside those version not making any sense. There should have been signs of the beating inside the house. Only dog blood was found on a baseboard. Julia's body was exhumed with the press in attendance to see if her palm print matched the blood smear on the baseboard. It did not, then someone decided to check the blood and it turned out to be canine. The third version by the state was impossible, at least to any viewers that have dogs. When she got home, Julia would have let the dogs out to do their business, but they would have been back inside very quickly to get their treats and be petted. Julia would never have been in the backyard. If she wasn't petting the dog, she would have been attending to the monkey and the parrot. In addition, Julia would never have left her hat lying on the entryway floor. Back in the late Victoria era, a proper lady's hat was a visible sign of who she was. Here is the 100 block of East Olive Street, and at the bottom is East Beach. This is a 2020 photo, but the plotting has not changed and most of the houses with the terracotta-colored roof were there in 1919. Here is the Wilkins house. About 9:25, Clara Duisberg and her uncle Max Meyer, who lived at 122 East Olive, heard peculiar sounds coming from the direction of the Wilkins house. That was 2 minutes before the Wilkins arrived at their house. Due to the gusty wind, they were uncertain of the exact origin and nature. Most likely it was Duke, the collie, howling as the robbers kicked him. Even in the strong wind, Duke had heard the familiar tapping of the doctor's umbrella cane on the concrete walk 2 houses away, and he ran to the door barking. After hearing the noise, Clara and the Duisberg maid went upstairs and from a bedroom window saw what they believed was the light of a flashlight in the home 3 doors from the Wilkins. The home where they saw the flashlight was the home of Max Meyer. Mr. Meyer was Clara's uncle and was living with the Duisbergs while his home was being remodeled, even though it was only 4 years old. By the time Clara and the maid got upstairs, the Wilkins had arrived at their side door. At 9:37, the doctor left Julia to get help. Many of the homes were vacant for the winter. He walked by the Errol's. He knew they didn't have a phone. At 9:39, the doctor arrived at the Coleman house. Cassius Coleman and his wife were not home. The doctor knocked and waited and probably knocked again. Cassius M. Coleman was the justice of the police and had a phone. The justice of the police, POLICE, in a village in New York was like the justice of the peace, PEACE, in a city. Cassius and his wife were at a village meeting in the village hall that everyone called the city hall. At 9:41, the doctor gave up on the Colemans and started walking to the Duisberg home. He had seen lights on at the Duisberg house when he and Julia walked home. At 9:43, he knocked on the Duisberg door. Clara Duisberg answered the door. Clara probably saw the doctor coming as she and the maid had been watching the light from the flashlight across the street. Clara guessed that the light was from a furnace man, but a furnace man should not have been upstairs. The doctor quickly told his story of burglars and the beating of Julia. Clara then got her parents and Max. The doctor told the story again. The Duisbergs did not have a phone, but Max knew the Schuberts on East Beach had a phone and he would go to their house. Then Dr. Wilkins walked back home to await help and help if he could. In the meantime, Max cut through the backyards to the Schubert home. Besides the Schuberts being home, there was Lieutenant Mangano, an army doctor who was courting Miss Frances O'Neill, a young teacher, who was being chaperoned by Mrs. Schubert. Lieutenant Mangano called the hospital for an ambulance and headed through the yards to the Wilkins house to help. One of the Schuberts called Sergeant Harry Schneider, who was now at police headquarters, at 9:52. He was the policeman that said he had walked most of the way home with the Wilkins. The ambulance arrived at 9:53. The doctor was on his knees stroking Julia's face. The attendant saw there was nothing could do for Julia. They loaded her into the ambulance, and by 9:57 were on the way back to the hospital less than a mile away. After the ambulance departed, the doctor walked back to the Duisbergs' house again. At the trial, Clara Duisberg said she met the doctor at the door at 10. Clara testified that he was crying emotionally. In getting help at 9:43, he had shown little emotion. He was probably functioning in his physician's mode earlier. By 10, he knew how severely Julia was injured and death was the only outcome. He needed to talk to someone, and maybe at just 14 years old, Clara, or maybe her mother, were strong women, and that was who the doctor needed at the moment. After a few minutes, the doctor headed back to his house. Just after 10:05 p.m., Patrolman Albert White and Sergeant Harry Schneider from the police department arrived at the Wilkins home. The doctor then flipped back into his pragmatic physician's mode, and for about the next half hour the doctor told and showed Patrolman White what happened. Sergeant Schneider stayed for a very short while, then went back to the police station. In showing Patrolman White what happened, the doctor found the likely murder weapons. The doctor picked up the hammer before Patrolman White could stop him. The new forensic technology of fingerprints was becoming known. One report also said the doctor picked up a heavy pipe of 1 1/2 inch diameter. Patrolman White stayed with the doctor until morning. About 10:20, the neighbors came to see what had happened. Both Mrs. Coleman and Mrs. Errol saw Julia's hat and handbag in the hallway. Also, Mrs. Coleman at the trial testified that the doctor told her that the burglars attacked Julia there, meaning the entryway hall. Dr. Wilkins loudly in court said nonsense. Nonsense. He was sticking to his hero's story. Throughout the night, more police from Rockville Center, members of the county sheriff, and neighbors walked around the house and yard. Early morning, just as the sun was rising at 6:35, Alan Myers of the famous William J. Burns Detective Agency arrived. He had gotten a tip from a law enforcement buddy. At about the same time, Police Chief Patrick Tracy arrived. Chief Tracy had worked tough New York City precincts and retired. Tracy came out of retirement and replaced Chief Pettit, who lasted only 2 years and was now working for the county managing zoning. Chief Pettit had replaced old Chief Charlie Hewitt, who got himself cut up pretty bad in a barroom fight. Aubrey Pettit, the former chief, had found a way to make the zoning job lucrative, especially for brothels and other illegal businesses that needed a storefront establishment. He ended up doing time in Sing Sing, as well as 3 other law enforcement persons you will meet. All 3 had a hand in convicting the old doctor. Private investigator Myers listened to the questioning of the doctor by Chief Tracy and learned that the doctor had been robbed of a watch, a diamond tie pin, and a wallet with $40 in it. Also, the doctor revealed that the robbers had not gotten $400 he was carrying in a hidden money belt under his vest. This was probably rent money, considering it was the end of the month. The tall man robber, the leader, was never caught for this crime, therefore, if he had knowledge of when to rob Walter Wilkins is unknown. Private investigator Myers then started inspecting the house and yard in good light at about 7 by himself. At the trial in June, Chief Tracy testified that he knew within 5 minutes that the doctor was lying. The doctor was indeed lying to be a hero, to be liked and respected. But he did not kill Julia, as Chief Tracy, Investigator Myers, and others concluded he did. Julia Wilkins arrived by ambulance at the Army Hospital just after 10 p.m. Probably no other facility would even have attempted to save her, but the Army had surgeons that had seen worse. She was conscious at times and assisted the doctors in turning her body, head, and being able to communicate to some degree. When the autopsy was done the next day, the doctors found nearly inch-long bone slivers from her skull driven into her brain. She was attended to by the hospital staff including Colonel Jolan J. Moorhead, Senior Army Surgeon, Major Edward Neff, Army surgeon, and Lieutenant James Mangano, physician. Both Moorhead and Neff operated on Mrs. Wilkins beginning about 11 p.m. At one time before the operation, she told one of the staff that there were 3 of them and they were young. This was reported by the Brooklyn Eagle on February 28. If Dr. Wilkins hadn't tried to inject his heroics with lies, the police and county detectives may have found the real burglar murders. 3.5 months later in June was the trial. By then, 7.5 months after the armistice halted the war, the hospital was no more and waiting to be converted back to a hotel. The staff had been deactivated and sent home. At the trial, only Dr. Moorhead, who lived in the New York City area, testified. He testified to the seriousness of the wounds. He had not been present when Julia said there was 3 of them. About 10 p.m., 3 men were seen by the Army Provost Marshal Guard. This unit secured the area around the Nassau Hotel Hospital and the bridges to and from Long Island. The 3 were completely out of place for that date, time of night, and location. It was at Broadway and Jackson Boulevard, now called Edwards Boulevard. In 1919, it was the location of the new Long Beach Hotel, nearby shops, restaurants, and saloons. Few would have been open in the winter at this time. When the member of the Provost Marshal approached, they ran. The Provost Marshal member then reported the incident to Sergeant Harry Schneider at the police station by telephone, who had just returned from the Wilkins house. We can assume that Sergeant Schneider called his police chief, Patrick Tracy. Since Chief Tracy, who lived in Brooklyn, did not come until morning, we can assume he told Sergeant Schneider to call the Rockville Center Police and asked for help. Captain William Phillips and 10 officers came, the first arriving after 11. As the full Rockville Center Corps of Police arrived, the island was eventually shut down about midnight. An out-of-place automobile was reported by a neighbor of the Wilkins, Mrs. Sadie Kiefer. She saw a car moving fast on the 100 block of East Olive with the curtains down as if for looking for someone, at about 9:45 that evening. Here is a picture of a 1916 Ford Touring Model T with the side curtains up, as would be expected on a cold, windy night. That would have been about the time the doctor was getting help from the Duisbergs and Max Myers for Julia. Also, it was about 20 minutes after Clara and the maid saw the flashlight in the upstairs of Max Myers' house that was being remodeled. More will come out later about a workman's ladder that mysteriously moved from the north side of the house to the west side that night. 3 men answering the physical description given by the doctor worked at the Army Field Garage and were absent Thursday for their shift, the day of the robbery and murder. They did come to work Friday. They never returned to work. They were never found or questioned. They had been commuting from somewhere on Long Island by train for 3 weeks to the Army Garage, and the railroad employees had noticed them. According to the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, the railroad employees, who did not want to get involved, wondered why the 3 were not found by someone, and surely the Army knew their names and maybe their addresses. In addition to the police dismissing the 3 men that did show up for work on Thursday and never returned after their Friday shift, and in addition to the 3 out-of-place men near the hospital 30 minutes after the encounter at the Wilkins house, and in addition to the out-of-place light from a flashlight seen upstairs in the Myers house 5 minutes before the encounter at the Wilkins house, there was also the walking ladder phenomenon. At the Meyer house, that was being remodeled, a ladder that was left in the rear of the house by workers when they went home on Thursday was found on the west side of the house going to the second-floor window Friday. Police dismissed the incident by saying they saw undisturbed dust on the floor of Myers' upstairs floor. At the indictment hearing, Police Chief Tracy called the testimony by Clara Duisberg, a 14-year-old female, about seeing the flashlight as bunk, and again as absolute bunk. With apologies to the viewer, this is a 1925 photo of the drawbridges across Reynolds Channel. The land at the top of the photo is Island Park, and Long Beach is at the bottom. Here is a quick look at the railroad drawbridge at water level. It has changed little since the channel was dredged. The automotive bridge on the right is the $1 million drawbridge finished in 1922. It is not the bridge that was there in 1919. The previous automobile drawbridge was more narrow and not as high off the water. The automobile bridge to the island was guarded by the Army Provost Marshal. About 10:45, County Detective Carmen Plant and County Sheriff Phineas Seaman arrived. Seaman questioned Dr. Wilkins. Detective Plant, hearing of the attack by 3 burglars, went to the automobile bridge. Selwyn Pearsall, the drawbridge tender, and the provost marshal guard reported they did not recall seeing any car with 3 men exiting Long Beach from around 9:30 and onward. But they had not been alarmed and therefore they did not inspect the cars for people laying down. The Brooklyn police, who were also called, were quite critical of the Nassau sheriff and local police. Both the railroad and automobile drawbridges could have been opened, thereby isolating the island, except by boat. We will hear more about Sheriff Seaman, who will be fired by the governor in disgrace, including his wife, who was running a black market business in the county jail. Detective Carmen Plant will be convicted of a felony and do time in Sing Sing. Mrs. Wilkins' body was autopsied Friday at the Army Hospital. It was performed by Colonel Moorhead and Major Neff, with Edward T. New, Justice of the Peace of Lynbrook, presiding. These were the 2 doctors that tried to save her and had already written the final reports on many soldiers who did not make it. 2 notable findings were the mortal wounds and her overall physical condition. The wounds were small and 12 in number, but by the time her body was exhumed twice and re-autopsied twice, it became 16 sensationalized, sickening bloody blows to the head. Julia was heavy-set and quite muscular by working in the yard and playing with the collies. At the autopsy, she was still wearing her white gloves. They had not been removed at the hospital. It makes one of the scenarios given to the grand jury for indictment impossible. The one where she leaves a bloody palm print on the stairway woodwork, but the indictment scenarios wasn't about the truth but way to put the old doc in jail. One reporter somehow knew she still was wearing her coat when she arrived at the hospital. This makes 2 of the scenarios by the state of the doctor beating her sometime after they entered the house highly unlikely. She would have taken off the coat when she entered her home. The state's case went through different scenarios of Julia being beaten in the bedroom or entryway hall, but by time of the trial the state was officially down to one version, but they had the William J. Burns Detective Agency give another version. For the jury, they could shop the state's presentation or Burns' presentation for something worth convicting the old doctor of. Due to the addition of Audrey Munson as a person of interest, this was the most nationally watched trial since the trial of Lizzie Borden, June of 1893, that resulted in an acquittal. By the state's final scenario, Julia went upstairs to her bedroom and removed her hat. Then she changed from brown gloves to her white gloves, which does not make any sense. Although by the calendar, it was well into the Edwardian era, but Julia was a lady of the late Victoria era. And brown gloves were for chores, and she would not have wore them to the city and back. The white button gloves were her to be seen in public, social gloves. Then, supposedly, she went down the stairs, puts on her coat, then went out the side door and into the backyard to play with one or both dogs. Then the doctor retrieves the 2 weapons he has hidden somewhere and goes outside and beats her. Then, he goes back inside and gets a pillow to make it look like he tried to comfort her. Then, he ransacked the house, beat 1 dog and the parrot, retrieved a workman's coat we will hear about later, stages the dining table with glasses and an empty liquor bottle, retrieves cigarette butts and throws them on the floor, hides his watch, hides $40, hides the tie pin, tears his coat, crushes his bowler hat, gives himself a minor head contusion that was treated later, and then heads out to a neighbor to get help. If one goes by the train conductor's time, all that happened in 10 minutes, which no jury seeing the frail old doctor would buy. Another problem with the state's trial version is Julia's hat. 2 neighbor ladies testified they saw Julia's hat on the hallway floor at approximately 10:30. The state had an expert witness go into detail on how the hat pins of her hat were crisscrossed in a manner meaning that Julia had deliberately taken off her to be put away for the day in her bedroom. Therefore, in staging the house, the doctor brought the hat down from the bedroom and errantly laid it down in the hall near Julia's purse. If the doctor had really staged the scene according to his hero version, both purse and hat would be outside near where Julia's beaten body laid. By his hero version, she never entered the house. Julia Wilkins' funeral was on March 4 at Holy Trinity Lutheran Church, a block and a half away from the Wilkins city home. For the fans of the 1984 movie Ghostbuster, that building just to the right of the church is the building where Bill Murray, Dan Aykroyd, Ernie Hudson, and Harold Ramis fight off the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man to save Sigourney Weaver. Mrs. Julia Wilkins was laid to rest at Lutheran All Faiths Cemetery in the Queens on March 4, 1919. May you rest in peace, Julia. For Julia, her rest in peace didn't last too long. 3 days later, she was dug up for another autopsy. The reason was to get her palm print to compare it to a blood smear on the woodwork on the stairway back in the Wilkins home. The DA, police, and sheriff apparently had not read the original autopsy report to know she was wearing her white gloves at the time of the autopsy. The logical assumption would have been she put them on some time at least before leaving the train station and had them on through the whole ordeal, including trying to save her life at the hospital. The blood smear turned out to be dog's blood, but the disinterment for another autopsy made for great press. Julia's second rest in peace lasted only 5 days. She was dug up again. The accusations against the doctor was coming from every angle. In defense, the doctor said if he wanted to kill Julia, he could have used poison. In fact, the doctor was using strychnine in small doses as a heart stimulus on himself. He would follow the strychnine with injection of morphine to cut the pain or maybe for the euphoric high. Even though Julie had enough blows to the head to put a donkey down, the district attorney had her autopsy for the 3rd time. Again, they looked at the head wounds and upped the count to 16. They also removed her stomach to look for poison and found nothing. The only thing accomplished was more local press, but now the Buffalo, New York paper, 400 miles away, was getting engaged into the story. In all, 3 detective agencies were employed by law enforcement to get the old doctor. The most reputable, at least now in hindsight, was the Schindler Detective Agency. Raymond Schindler's capabilities of minute research is still well regarded today. Mr. Schindler worked for the Chief of Police of Long Beach, then was let go as the county took over the investigation. The county being the Sheriff's Department with oversight by the DA. Another agency was the Plogo Agency, who mainly tracked the doctor, especially when he was in New York City. Alan O. Myers, of the Burns Agency, who was previously introduced, arrived at sunrise about 8 hours after Julia's death. He heard Police Chief Tracy question the doctor. He was not hired at the time to be working the case but was the first to explore the backyard in the daylight, and he also went into the house. He had unsupervised access to the house and again 3 days later entered the house by having one of the county detectives, probably Carmen Plant, instruct the doctor that he was needed at the county seat for questioning. Through Myers' connection to the sheriff's department and what he must have claimed he could do after working the house and the yard, unsupervised, the Schindler Agency was fired and the Burns Agency hired. After being hired, Myers unabashedly stated he rigged traps for the purpose of catching the doctor moving supposedly incriminating evidence around the house. His trap shows his cleverness but also shows he does not give a damn about the Fourth Amendment. Back in 1919, to search someone home, a magistrate of justice, at least the doctor's neighbor, justice of the police, Cassius Coleman, or higher in the county, had to sign off to search the Wilkins resident based on probable cause. The author guesses that in Myers' unauthorized searches, if he does not claim he found anything, then the illegal searches becomes a moot point. Later we will hear about how much evidence Carmen Plant and his associates amazingly found after the chain of events would suggest a search warrant had finally been issued. The William J. Burns International Detective Agency took the lead at the crime scene. They produced some evidence in a crime scenario. Burns himself testified at the doctor's trial. Burns went on to become the director of the Bureau of Investigation before it was called the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. His picture hangs in the Hall of Directors. Due to the Teapot Dome scandal, if a sack could be put over any picture, it would be his. He did get sentenced to jail time but avoided it. More details will be presented in Part 4 of The Secret of the Angel. In fiction, it can be easy to organize the players, but this is real life 100 years ago. So here is a review of who we already met, and on the next pages are some new people. Unfortunately, the author cannot find a photo for everyone. We already delved deep enough into these 10. You already met Raymond Schindler. Lester Chadwick's role will come up in finding incriminating evidence in the Wilkins house. Later he rose to the rank of captain in the Lynbrook Police Department, and will also do time in Sing Sing for running a protection racket for brothels on Long Island. He was Carmen Plant's brother-in-law. David Manning was the judge in Dr. Wilkins' trial. He had a modestly distinguished career, but at the Wilkins trial, his role was getting it done. Cassius Coleman, the neighbor who wasn't home when the old doc went for help. He will come up again when the doctor was arrested. Cassius Coleman will stay pretty quiet in his role that is heavily influenced by Police Chief Tracy and Mr. William Reynolds but not his wife Minnie. Her testimony at the trial contradicts both the doctor and the DA's scenarios. She was quite the lady in the Red Cross and helping the wounded soldiers at the hospital. Charles Wissong was the doctor's lead defense attorney. He was getting up in years and for the most part was relying on the doctor's position in life to get him through. He had been the former DA of Nassau County, but lost to Charles Week at the polls too. Sam Whitehouse was second chair and a jack of all law on the Long Beach Island. Louis Fries was a competent business attorney from the city going back to when Julia was married to Otto Kraus, but the murder trial is not his proficiency. Max Meyer was a neighbor owning the house where the latter mysteriously moves around at night. He was also a major player in glove manufacturing in the city and advertises almost daily in the city newspapers. Clara Duisberg was only 14 but solidly testified at the trial even though Police Chief Tracy calls it bunk, absolutely bunk. Sergeant Harry Schneider plays a key role in all three of the state's versions. Without his contradiction of train conductor Boyd's testimony of the time the Wilkins left the station, the state would not have a case at all. Patrolman White was the first law enforcement person to be with the doctor after Julia was taken to the hospital. He talked to the doctor and walked through the crime scene. He was with the doctor when the hammer and lead pipe were found and the doctor picked them up. Patrolman White testified for the defense about fraudulent evidence and was fired by Chief Tracy 4 days after the trial was over. The firing will come up in Part 4 of The Secret of the Angel. Doctors Moorhead, Neff, and Mangano tried to save Julia at the Army Hospital. By the time of the trial, only Moorhead was locally available. We don't know if the defense attorney tried to find Mangano after being discharged from duty in Long Beach. It may have been worthy to hear what the two doctors, Wilkins and Mangano, did and said when they were tending to Julia, before the ambulance arrived. Detective Babuti worked for the county and was under District Attorney Charles R. Weeks. He has only a minor role in this case but was at the firing of Patrolman White. What was a county detective doing at the firing of a local village policeman? Barbuti also does time in Sing Sing for framing a fellow law enforcement person after executing a raid on a protected brothel. Train conductor Boyd saw the Wilkins leave the station at 9:15, but Sergeant Schneider said it was 9:08. Conductor Boyd and his wife casually knew the Wilkins. Mr. and Mrs. Errol were the elderly next-door neighbors on the east side of the Wilkins. Mrs. Errol also saw and testified about seeing Julia's hat and purse in the entryway hall. Mr. and Mrs. Duisberg were neighbors of the Wilkins and the parents of Clara Duisberg. Mrs. Duisberg was the sister of Max Meyer. Doctors A. D. Jacques, F. T. Delano, and Otto H. Schultz performed the second autopsy on Julia, and again Dr. A. D. Jacques presided on the third autopsy. Dr. Schultz was there on behalf of District Attorney Swan of New York County, that is Manhattan Island. Since Julia Wilkins owned property in the city, this warranted attention from the DA as well as all the ongoing publicity. In New York County, the position of District Attorney was, and is, hotly politically contested. Duke and Duchess were Julia's rough collies. Duchess, the one on the left, did come back, 3 days later after the murder. Charles Klein was a furnace man that stoked coal into furnaces of absent homeowners. He did admit he was in the area but testified he had nothing to do with the Wilkins house, but was in the basement of the Meyer house. Gardner Hull had a printing business in Lower Manhattan. He was a soul-saving evangelist that visited the old doctor in Nassau County Jail as he awaited trial. Mr. Hull will come up again in Part 4 of The Secret of the Angel when he was robbed and murdered with hammer blows to his skull. Elizabeth Worth Muller was a friend of Julia. She lived in the Nassau Hotel before it became a hospital. She loved Julia's pets. She was a lawyer and probably helped Julia write her 1915 last will and testament. Charles Hansen was Nassau County's fingerprint expert. His first reports nearly exclude the doctor but are not presented at the trial. The courtroom and the hall at the courthouse was packed with spectators and reporters. The trial was a front-page story in contrast to the never-ending front-page stories concerning the aftermath of the Great War in Europe. The people were tired with whatever President Wilson was doing in Europe. Many thought we should not have been there in the first place. The United States government sent $6 billion to European governments from 1919 to 1923. All the giveaway happened as the United States economy went into the toilet. Stock prices collapsed by the end of 1919. The downturn in wholesale prices came 6 months later. By the autumn of 1920, a severe industrial depression had developed. Factory employment dropped 30% from March 1920 to July 1921. The Quakers and the America Red Cross stepped up to get aid to the people on the streets and farms. The two actually got over $300 million to the people. A de facto group of women that got to the courtroom early enough to have a gallery and called themselves the Free Wilkins League of Women were vocal, according to reporters. Before ending Part 3 of The Secret of the Angel with a guilty verdict on Friday, June 27, we will go over the key issues that convicted Dr. Wilkins and the key issues that should have freed him. Also, upon receiving the guilty verdict from the jury, Judge Manning announced to the court that he would impose the death sentence the following Tuesday when the formal sentencing proceeding would take place. In the author's mind, these are the keys to the case, and what the jury considered the most relevant. We will first look at the items stolen from the doctor. The broken watch crystal was found supposedly by County Detective Carmen Plant near where beaten Julia has laid. The author believes it was found by Plant's acquaintance, private investigator Alan O. Myers. From the timeline, it looks like Myers was the first to search the yard in the morning's light, and he brags about searching the house without supervision. Since he was not on the job, the Williams J. Burns agency had not been hired, Myers gave it to Plant. According to the state's final scenario, the doctor broke his watch that was in his pocket and the crystal jumped out while beating Julia with the pipe and then the hammer. Next, the crystal did indeed match the broken watch found in a couch in the Wilkins' home. It was supposedly found by Lester Chadwick, Carmen Plant's brother-in-law, when he was staying at the Wilkins house with the doctor under unofficial house arrest. The author believes it was found in the backyard by Myers, it was given to Plant, and revealed just before the indictment hearing. Allegedly, the brilliant doctor who could concoct this elaborate deception of 3 burglars was so stupid he left incriminating worthless evidence laying around just waiting to be found. The doctor also reported his diamond tie pin was stolen, but the one presented at the trial, supposedly found by Myers, hidden in a drawer, was a cheap pin that had been poorly repaired. Somehow Patrolman Elbert White, the first law enforcement person to be with the doctor, knew the presented repaired pin was a setup and testified for the defense, and was fired 4 days after the verdict that included a weekend. The press caught wind of the firing and talked to White. Elbert White said he was going to talk to District Attorney Charles Weeks about the whole thing. 2 days later, Weeks reported to the press he did not influence Chief Tracy in any way and the matter was closed. Not explained was why Weeks' boys, Plant and Barbuti, both from the county, were at the local police firing. Of course, the valuable diamond tie pin was gone and probably pawned somewhere. The next thing found in the house was $40. This was found by Alan Myers via the traps he set. Supposedly, he caught the old doctor moving $40 from one secret place to another secret place. Since it was exactly $40, it had to be the $40 the doctor said was stolen, and the doctor was lying. Actually, the 40 was probably out of Myers' billfold. Think about it, the doctor was carrying $400 and it was his house, so what does this $40 mean that supposedly moved from one place to another? Last, the men's pocketbook was found in the backyard. Supposedly the doctor was staging the scene and threw it away in the yard. Reporters that had wandered through the Wilkins house Friday morning along with law enforcement from 5 different agencies, 1 unhired private investigators and many neighbors, reported the house was ransacked from top to bottom, including the attic. The most controversial thing was the dining table. On the table was an empty bottle. One report was it was a brandy bottle and another a whiskey bottle. Also on the table was 3 empty glasses. At the trial, the glasses were said to have been dusty, therefore the doctor staged the whole thing, including the cigarette butts all over the floor. The last thing to accept as truth from these detectives was dust on the glasses, but maybe there was, and one of the burglars got the bottle of liquor and the 3 glasses from the cabinet, and instead of using the glasses, they just passed the bottle around for what little was left. They then lit up their cigarettes and talked about how little they had found to rob, and maybe they should wait to see if the owners come home and rob them. Julia kept her good jewelry in the city. Another item supposedly staged by the old doctor was a workman's coat that the doctor found and gave to the police. The state's case was that the old doctor with a heart condition staged the whole house, got the 2 weapons out of hiding, then chased down Julia in the backyard and beat her, and at some time beat the dog and the parrot and covered the monkey in his cage with a cloth. All this happened in about 17 minutes according to Sergeant Schneider's timeline from when the Wilkins left the station. On one of Alan O. Myers' searches, we don't know if it was a legal search or not, he supposedly looked in the dog's bed. The next time he searched the house, there was a roll of money totaling $71. One of the bills was reported to have blood on it. Whether it was human blood, dog's blood, or Julia's cosmetics was never defined. The doctor said Julia commonly hid money in the dog's bed. The whole incident, if there really was one, was to imply the doctor was doing something deceitful and somehow the blood or just a red stain tied it to the crime. At the time, much of the English-speaking world was obsessed with Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes, and how the most insignificant clues are the key to the mystery. In most of his cases, the mystery revolves around people not being who they really are, but in The Scandal in Bohemia, one of the keys to solving the mystery was a photograph of Irene Adler, a fictional character. The photo was minutiae at first, but becomes important later, as hopefully was the roll of money with the red stain, was to the armchair sleuths following the Wilkins case in the newspapers. Julia, and probably with the help of her friend Elizabeth Worth Muller, drew up a will in May of 1915. It was to replace the old will of 1903 that her business attorney Louis G. Fries wrote after the divorce and disappearance of her ex-husband Otto Kraus. Mrs. Muller most likely knew Caroline Dodge, the daughter of Mrs. Susan and Nathan P. Dodge of Council Bluffs, Iowa. Both Caroline and Elizabeth studied together at the School of Law, New York University. Caroline went on to be one of a group of 6 women to be the first women admitted to the New York bar, before moving back to Council Bluffs and also becoming one of the first women in the state of Iowa to be admitted to the Iowa bar. In the 1915 will, Julie left Walter the residence in Long Beach and New York City. She also left him $46,000 to take care of her pets and maintain her grave and her son's graves. There may have been other minor bequeaths, but the balance of her rental estate, which was considerable, was left to her niece and nephew. The Long Beach home had a considerable mortgage, so if the doctor rented the city apartment, the rent money could pay on the mortgage to keep the Long Beach house going, and Walter could use the $46,000 to live on and take care of the pets and graves. The doctor found the 1915 will and showed it to the business attorney, Louis Fries. Fries told Walter he was in big trouble. We don't know today how to interpret big trouble, but back in March of 1919 it caused the doctor to tear out the testament page. Walter then gave the 1915 will to Attorney Fries, who then gave it to District Attorney Charles Weeks. We can surmise, with the testament page torn out, the doctor hoped the will would be declared invalid and the motive of inheriting money be negated. That did not happen. By forensic examination, it was determined a page where the testament page should have been was removed. In one of the searches of the doctor's house by the county investigators, the old 1903 will was found in a trunk in the attic. Of course, the doctor did not get any money from the 1903 will because Julia and Walter had not met. The publicity over the case went national if not international after Weeks revealed the wills, establishing a motive and announcing that Audrey Munson was a person of interest. The publicity went something like this. Dr. Walter Wilkins, a prominent physician of New York City and of the exclusive Long Beach Estates community, savagely killed his kind and caring wife of 13 years, thereby hoping to inherit her money so he could buy the favors of the beautiful Audrey Munson, the 1915 exposition girl, and also known for her nudity in movies, photography and paintings. After the mess surrounding the 1915 will, the old doctor needed the help of a strong woman. Probably the strongest woman he knew was Elizabeth Kirkland Shepard, most commonly known by her stage name of Odette Tyler. She was living in Washington, D.C. and married. His name was McLean. He was also an actor, whose real name was Shepard and was of the founding family of Shepherdstown, West Virginia, about 70 miles from Washington, D.C. Walter was also probably sick of Deputy Lester Chadwick staying in his house snooping around. Chadwick was the one who found the broken watch in a couch and would later do time for running a brothel and selling protection for other brothel operators. On the morning of March 15, when Chadwick was away, the doctor headed to the train station and boarded the train to the city. Then through the busy Pennsylvania Railroad station. Then on to Baltimore's Union Station, arriving at night. He checked into the Hotel Joyce. The doctor had shaved all his facial hair before leaving Long Beach but was still wearing his signature Victoria era bowler hat. He traveled from Pennsylvania Station as the Mr. R.C. Howe. He carried a fictional letter composed to a fictional Louis Baumgarten for the purpose of business. At the hotel he somehow found out Odette was in Los Angeles. While the doctor was still missing, the politically ambitious district attorney was on a roll. For the 4 days since the old doc fled, Weeks' name had been on the front page of every newspaper in the area and also outstate newspapers such as the Buffalo Inquirer and the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle. But he wanted the whole state to know his name. The opportunity was right for a new face in Albany, New York. The Republican New York State Attorney General, Charles D. Newton, was having problems and getting long in the tooth. Al Smith, the Democratic governor, was not acting like a good Northern Democrat. He was not in step with President Woodrow Wilson's globalism, and Smith was acting like one of the Democratic governors from south of the Mason-Dixon line that thought their states had more rights than the feds. In the 1928 presidential election, he could not carry his own state but won Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and 6 states of the Deep South. Weeks had had Theodore Roosevelt's endorsement, but old Teddy had died 2.5 months earlier, still carrying a bullet in his chest from the failed assassination attempt back in October of 1912. The newspapers had photos and the story of the old doc being taken to jail for the evening editions and next morning edition. Sometime in the afternoon of Thursday, March 20th, even without the old doc in custody, Weeks would start his presentation against Dr. Walter Keene Wilkins before the grand jury, and wrapping up on Friday. Weeks would get an indictment one way or another. The Friday presentation, with bloody morbid details, should keep the press busy over the weekend. On Monday, March 24th, he would call a press conference, including the syndicated press that would put his name on thousands of newspapers. Monday is when he would drag Audrey Munson into the murder. The most damaging evidence against the doctor, and probably the most manufactured, was the murder weapon. One assailant using the pipe stunned and caused Julia to fall to the ground. Another assailant using the hammer killed Julia. It was the assailant that murdered Julia, not the hammer. We don't want to start a conversation on assault hammers. The New York Tribune and other newspapers reported on March 2nd a briefing by Police Chief Tracy. The fingerprint expert, Charles Hanson, described that whoever used the hammer used their left hand. Since the back of Julia's head was hit at least 10 times with a hammer, it is reasonable to assume the murder was left-handed. If the old doc was left-handed, it would have been sensationalized as a case closer at the briefing. Also, the mechanic's hammer had a split handle and was repaired by winding wire around the split. Hanson said the murderer had a scar on his index finger. He also found prints on the pipe. If the prints on both weapons had been solely the doctor's, the case was over, but they weren't, and the investigation dragged on for another 3.5 months, which was unprecedented at that time in Nassau County. By the time of the trial, a new feature had been added to the hammer to explain the cleverness of the doctor in preparing the weapon to conceal his prints on the hammer. The hammer presented as evidence at the trial had paper wrapped around the handle and tied with 16-strand twine. Of course, the matching paper and matching twine had been found in the house by Carmen Plant's team. The author does not believe Charles Hanson, the fingerprint expert, or Patrolman White, who was present when the hammer was found, were called by the defense to refute the paper-wrapped handle. Since fingerprints were not presented by the prosecution, nor was the discovery, Hanson and White were not required at the trial. They may not have been able to take time off, nor would they have wished to be at the trial. Law enforcement in Nassau County that went against the establishment might find themselves fired, as it happened to White, or framed by Thomas Babuti. Why the doctor didn't wrap the pipe with paper, if it was so important to wrap the hammer's handle in paper, was never explained. The importance of the paper-wrapped hammer to disguise the doctor's prints was the ticket to Old Sparky at Sing Sing. It was absolute proof the killing was premeditated and first-degree murder. The motive was the house and some money. The doctor supposedly also had the opportunity with respect to time, if one bought Sergeant Harry Schneider's timeline over Conductor Boyd's timeline. At the trial, the prosecution had a workman testify he had used a mechanic's hammer at the Wilkins house. This was to contradict a statement made by the doctors to investigators, that he didn't own a hammer. On cross-examination, the workman said the hammer he thought he had used had a longer handle and that it was not spliced with wire. The trial began on June 9th and only accomplished selecting 2 jurors on the first day after the puffing and posturing by both the defense and prosecuting attorneys. This was the spousal murder trial of the century. The national spotlight was on Mineola, New York. No less than 23 New York newspapers carried front-page articles of the beginning day in their evening edition, and 12 more the next day in their morning editions. The jury was not filled until Friday the 13th, as the defense and prosecutor performed for the media. Charles Weeks would begin the prosecution's case on Monday the 16th. Finally, after a week of jury selection, an unheard of time length for back in the day, District Attorney Charles R. Weeks was ready to present the state's case. The state's case was supposedly based upon motive, but Dr. Wilkins was better off being married to Julia and enjoying the income from her rental property. Neither the 1903 will, written before Julia and Walter met, or the 1915 will, entitled the doctor to her rental property. The 1915 will left the doctor with the house and money to care for the pets and Julia's family graves. To make the 1915 will, the motive Weeks had to imply the doctor was ready to blow the money foolishly on someone. Hence the need for Audrey Munson, who for years was considered to have the world's most perfect female body. The doctor, who had seen the bodies of Broadway's most beautiful women for decades, supposedly killed his wife to give Miss Munson money for her physical favors. Weeks' job was to convict the doctor, and whatever damage done to Miss Munson was not his problem. Any meaningful evidence was circumstantial at best and most likely manufactured by the investigators. For the county, 3 of the investigators would do time in Sing Sing. The sheriff, along with his wife, who was running a black market for jail inmates, was disgracefully dismissed by the New York State governor, who overstepped his authority in doing so, but the situation warranted the action. Highly prejudicial testimony was given by the chief of police, who was in the pocket of William Reynolds, who had the most to gain by finding the old doc guilty and not some gang from Brooklyn or wherever. Also giving meaningless testimony from a case standpoint, but well regarded because he was billed as America's Sherlock Holmes, was William J. Burns, who would become the most disgraced director of the United States Bureau of Investigation. Weeks was well prepared and took over a week. Besides the questionable evidence and testimony from lead investigator, he exploited every inconsistency, whether or not it was relevant. His strategy was to fill the state's bag of evidence and testimony so full of anything that the jury would find the doctor guilty. The lead defense attorney, Charles Y. Song, started his presentation Tuesday morning. He recalled Alan O. Meyer and asked a meaningless question, then asked Judge Manning to dismiss the case. The judge denied the request, and then Y. Song presented an outline of the defense. Prior to the trial, Y. Song had promised the press over 30 witnesses and a weeks-long defense. Y. Song did call 15 witnesses, and subtracting for cross-examination time by the state, his defense lasted barely more than 1 day. He wrapped up the defense by testifying himself about the light brown work coat that the state claimed was planted by the doctor, along with other phony evidence that the doctor supposedly planted to stage the crime. By 11:50 a.m., on the defense's second day, the doctor was on the stand telling his story. The doctor's demeanor and capabilities during testimony and cross-examination ranged from sharpness to blank confusion, and he had one total breakdown. Today he would probably been diagnosed with some form of early dementia. The first thing Thursday morning, the jury as a group went by bus from the Mineola courthouse to the Wilkins Long Beach home and returned. This trip was a request by the jury. After lunch, Y. Song began his summation. He missed the opportunity to destroy or at least significantly diminish the money motive by not calling his own third chair, Louis Freeze, to testify on the value to the doctor of the 1915 will, that the state insisted was valid, and therefore the motive. The Long Beach house, the one the doctor would have received, was heavily mortgaged, around $35,000. In summation, Y. Song said the doctor would have realized only $11,000. Presumably, that was after using part of the $46,000 bequeathed to pay off the mortgage. Since the doctor's medical practice was all but over, he would be without means and living on charity from friends within a year. In summation, Y. Song accused the state's investigators and especially private investigator Alan O. Myers of manufacturing false evidence, which they most assuredly did. Y. Song finished at 2:30 p.m. and Weeks gave the state's summation, finishing a little after 4:30. By 5 p.m., after Judge Manning gave instructions to the jury had 5 options: murder, first or second degree; manslaughter, first or second degree, or acquittal. They broke for supper and returned at 7:15. At 11:15 p.m., they asked the judge for the coroner's report that had been referred to but never entered as evidence. They also asked for the testimony of the doctor. Judge Manning denied the coroner's report due to its non-existence as evidence and told the jury that verbally reading of the doctor's testimony would take 5 hours, since it was only in shorthand and not transcribed yet. The jury foreman, Oscar Parias, passed on the 5-hour reading, and the judge told them to get back to work. At 3:40 p.m. on Friday, after going all night, all morning and part of the afternoon with no let-up and deliberation, the jury came back with a murder in the first-degree guilty verdict but recommended mercy. The jury members had not seen a bed in over 30 hours. Prior to the verdict, Judge Manning told reporters he would dismiss the jury after 24 hours, declaring a hung jury, but did not tell the jurors for concern they would abandon the deliberation process. With 1 hour and 35 minutes left on the judge's timeline, they came back with a guilty verdict. It was the longest deliberation on record for Nassau County. Judge Manning did set a formal sentencing date of Tuesday, July 1st, but immediately informed the court he would deny the request for mercy, saying it pained him not to do so, but cited the state's requirement in such a case, and said he would sentence Dr. Wilkins to be executed. In a most unusual requirement, especially since the formal sentencing was 4 days away, Judge Manning announced he would order that the doctor would be driven to his death at Sing Sing by Carmen Plant, the county's lead investigator, that miraculously kept coming up with incriminating evidence. Sing Sing is New York's maximum security prison in Ossining, New York. Carmen Plant, along with then-Sheriff Phineas Seaman, were to drive the doctor to Sing Sing on Tuesday, July 1st, after the morning's formal sentencing of death. Jurors interviewed by the press said the most significant factors in finding the doctor guilty was his fleeing to Baltimore in March and the 1915 will that was motive. We are at the end of Part 3 of The Secret of the Angel, and there were no angels anywhere. The doctor's hamartia, defined in ancient literature as a personal tragic human flaw that leads to more misfortune, is at the heart of Part 3. The doctor wanted to be the hero in this tragedy, bravely defending his beloved wife, but wasn't. Without a strong woman in his life, he was lost, and his efforts to manipulate what is perceived to be the motive, the will, was a failure. His human flaw opens the door to evildoers. In Part 4 of The Secret of the Angel, An Angel Has Finally Risen, we see the tragic suicide of the doctor, also the confession by a young man, the one on the right, of killing Julia with hammer blows to the head. Just as he did his employer. The one on the left knocked the employer down with a club before the other one finished him with the hammer. All for about $200. We will see what happens to the goon squad of District Attorney Charles Weeks, and also the rise and fall of William J. Burns. The beautiful Audrey Munson never recovered from the humiliation as being portrayed as being capable of selling her affection for the right amount of money. Audrey had walked a narrow line balancing nudity with artistry. She was the imaginary girl next door, unembarrassedly naked. She would spend the last 64 years of her life in an insane asylum. In Council Bluffs, and Dodge and Ella Dodge Pusey canceled the extravagant 1919 dedication of the angel to honor their mother. The face of the angel sculpted by Daniel French was that of Audrey Munson, who was implied to be involved in the nationally followed Wilkins murder case. The Council Bluffs angel, a costly memorial fountain that everyone was to see, was finally dedicated in the late winter of 1920. No one except the immediate family was there for one of Iowa's most perfect statements of art, to honor the matriarch of Iowa's most noted historic family, the Dodges.